We know all about the power struggle between the US and China, but this week we saw it play out on the San Diego coastline. The US president, along with the UK and Australian prime ministers, gathered before a strategically placed submarine as they announced the AUKUS Pact. That's essentially a deal to provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarines to patrol the Pacific Ocean.
It's an honor to be here to welcome Prime Minister Albanese and Prime Minister Sunak.
In the last 18 months, the challenges we face have only grown. Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, China's growing assertiveness, the destabilizing behavior of Iran and North Korea.
Forging this new partnership, we're showing again how democracies can deliver.
We are bound, above all, by our belief in a world where the sovereignty of every nation is respected.
They weren't explicit in saying this is all about concerns over China, but there's no question that is what this is about. And China hit back quickly, Beijing accusing the US, the UK and Australia of embarking on a path of error and danger. I'm Sally Lockwood, in for Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily.
It's almost as though conflict with China, not cold conflict, but hot conflict, has been baked in as something that's now inevitable.
Both sides have got to a stage where they can't seem to reasonably de-escalate even relatively small things. That's pretty worrying.
That's Mark Stone and Helen-Ann Smith, our US and Asia correspondents. We got together on a video call to discuss this growing tension and distrust between the two superpowers.
Can I just ask, Helen-Ann, are you in your apartment?
I am.
Oh my goodness, that gives me nostalgia. I used to live in that very block.
Wow.
Just above Jenny Lou's.
You're also really close to Jenny Lou's. It's really the only place that you can buy things like Marmite and peanut butter. So,
Mark, Helen-Ann, it's great to have you with us. Mark, let's just begin with you explaining, if you can, exactly what's been announced in San Diego and why it's so significant.
It's all about submarines, Sally, at least in the short term. And I say short term because we're still talking a very long time. And it is about using British technology and American technology to help Australia replace their submarine fleet. In practical terms, that's what it's about. The Australian submarine fleet is coming to the end of its life. It needs a new one. And a deal has been done in which the Americans in the medium term will sell some existing submarines to the Australians, but in the longer term, we're talking 2030s, 2040s, the Brits and the Americans will build submarines for the Australians and with the Australians. That is, in practical terms, what it's about. What it's really about, in one word, is China.
That is a neat link over to you, Helen-Ann. Explain to us, if you can, how China's responded to this submarine pact and the sort of rhetoric we've been hearing out of California.
Yeah, well, I mean, very broadly, the Chinese have responded with pretty predictable anger, frustration, indignation. A lot of the phrases we've had have been sort of right out of a pretty familiar playbook. So a spokesperson from the foreign ministry described it as a typical Cold War mentality that the countries are, quote, traveling down a dangerous and wrong path. You know, they say that it's encouraging an arms race, and broadly they're, deeply, deeply unhappy about it. I think it touches on a few things for China. I mean, firstly, it really doesn't like kind of shows of unity from its quote unquote enemies, if you like, in a kind of public, the photo shoots, that very global display of kind of unity against them. They find that very provocative. But really, sort of most importantly, the reason China hates this so very much is really the island of Taiwan. And everything in the region really comes back to that when it comes to kind of defense and security and whatnot. Fundamentally, the self-governing island of Taiwan that China sees as its own, it has repeatedly said, the current leadership, that it reserves the right to take that island by force. And frankly, if and when it does make such a move, the last thing it wants is a strong defense pact in that region that would prevent it taking the action it wants.
I think that's the first point you made, Helen-Ann, is really interesting about the show. I was actually quite surprised at the extent to which the Brits, the Americans and the Australians decided to make a show of this to such an extent. 3 world leaders standing in San Diego, a submarine behind them, US Marines all around. They could quite easily have just got their defense ministers to make an announcement, and they could have done something very low key. It would have been just a defense deal, some sort of a contract that had been done between these two countries. But instead, they decided to go all out and have this massive show. And they absolutely knew that the Chinese response would be very angry.
Is that interpreted as inflammatory in China, Helen-Ann?
Yeah, it's deeply inflammatory in terms of how the Chinese perceive it. Absolutely. And the reason that it is I think it really touches on this perception that the Chinese have about what it calls sort of the policy of containment. And this is a word that has just dominated all of the conversation when it comes to China versus the West, particularly in recent months, because the Chinese, hold this fundamental belief, and it really pervades everything that they do and say, that the US-led alliance of the West, if you like, fundamentally Western countries have a problem in principle with China in ascendancy, that it has a problem in principle with China growing and developing, and that, frankly, it will do everything it can to stop that. And that's why these very public shows upset China so much, because they see it as part of a very self-conscious attempt to circumvent China's growth and China's ascendancy and China's power, and crucially, circumvent it from taking what it sees as its sort of rightful place at the center of global affairs.
What Joe Biden calls it is competition, not confrontation. So what he would say is all we want is healthy competition between two great superpowers. We do not want confrontation. And I think, at the outset, it is worth saying that I don't think there is any desire by either nation for confrontation. They don't want confrontation, at least not at the moment. But the optics have changed. That sort of kind of irritating word we use in the media. The optics have changed, and the rhetoric has changed significantly on both sides. And I think what's happened in the last 10 years, suddenly China is doing what the West has been doing for years. I mean, the West has been interfering in other nations' business and trying to mold a world order that they would see as being the right world order, a Western world order, a democratic world order. They've been doing that for years and years and years. Suddenly there's a new player on the pitch, and it's China. And it's doing it naturally to its own world order as it sees it. But for years and years, historians have been waiting for that moment where the rise of China is suddenly going to come. And I think that time has now come. And America's like, we've got to do something about this. We're no longer the only player in town.
And Helen-Ann, just explain to us from a Beijing perspective, with President Xi's third term in office now underway, are we seeing a hardening of Chinese rhetoric towards the US?
Well, that's a really, really interesting question, because let's be clear, a very key difference between China and the US is that China guards its words extremely carefully. So very small moves in rhetoric can mean a very great deal in China in the way that they don't in America. Things don't get said by accident here. Look, China has always been much more skeptical of the West, right? It has been skeptical of the West for centuries. And so its narrative and its rhetoric towards the US have always been colder. They've always been harder. But there has been notable kind of ramping up, just small signs. Just for instance, last week, President Xi Jinping himself spoke about the containment policy led by the United States. And that's a really important thing, because normally he would have left that to his more junior ministers to really stick the boot in like that. The fact he chose to say it out loud and be quoted on it was significant. The Chinese are hardening their line. And I just think it's really interesting picking up what Mark said about the posturing. My goodness, the posturing matters here so much. And it matters for slightly different reasons than in the US, of course. It doesn't have Chinese Communist Party does not have an opposition party with which to answer to. It does not have a voting public that might boot it out in the next election. But face saving matters so much here. And it is a deeply patriotic place, China, right? Not just the government, but the people. And this kind of phenomenal economic rise that China has seen, this new world order that it is able to set, its new place in the world. People are really proud of it. And the government is really proud of it. And that sense that it would be challenged and contained is really offensive. And that explains a lot of why I think dialing down from this very difficult position we're in right now is going to be very difficult on both sides.
Mark, I can see you nodding. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, just the first point that Helen-Ann said, I completely agree with, that nothing is ever said by mistake in China. And the opposite is often the case in America, because it is a democracy, because you've got so many different people chiming in. And so things are said that might not sort of toe the administration, the US administration line. And, America is seen around the world now as being less reliable. If you talk to countries in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Israel to a certain extent, the Gulf Arab countries, they no longer see America as a reliable partner because they see America as retreating, because they see the flip-flop politics of America. You've got Biden 1 minute and then Trump the next minute. We could have Trump back again. And the foreign policy under modern American Republican Party and Democratic Party, it is not uniform. Because of all that, they cannot rely on America. And so they're looking elsewhere and they're looking for a more reliable partner. China's politics never changes, right? So if you want something that's more reliable, that's going to be uniform, then it's China. And it was absolutely fascinating to see the Saudi leaders and the Iranian leaders pop up in Beijing to announce a new peace pact. I mean, no one expected that. I mean, it was an amazing moment where suddenly the Chinese had managed to forge this new alliance. That was very significant.
China is very self-consciously selling that reliability and that kind of lack of flip-flopping and that sort of steadfastness, not just because it thinks it will advantage it, but because it truly believes that it is a better way to run a country.
And in light of that, just a quick thought from you both, if I may, on the fact that we are now seeing this great power struggle between the US and China. Could we now potentially be seeing the two nations entering a new Cold War, Mark?
I think we're already pretty much there. I find I'm sort of constantly surprised at the extent to which it's almost as though conflict with China, not cold conflict, but hot conflict, has been baked in as something that's now inevitable down the line. I mean, you turn on the cable news channels here and the straps at the bottom of the screen are, the threat of China. It permeates everything, the spy balloons. It was only a month ago that we thought maybe that Antony Blinken was going to go to Beijing. That would have been a huge moment. He'd have met Xi Jinping, and yet it was all cancelled. So, yeah, I think we are in a period of entering a very tricky moment for, let's be absolutely clear, the most important geopolitical relationship in the world, because it is China-America.
To add to that, I think I think we are already there. Mark mentioned the spy balloon incident, and I think that's a really, really interesting one, because I think what that did is it really proved the inability of both sides to resolve even the most trivial of matters, right? Fundamentally, both countries know they're spying on each other, and one balloon kind of floating over is not really that big a deal, but neither side could possibly find a way to de-escalate that situation, right? And as a consequence, we lost the Blinken visit, as Mark said, and things have really spiraled since. And because both sides have got to a stage where they can't seem to reasonably de-escalate even relatively small things, that's pretty worrying in terms of how that Cold War is and how it has the potential to develop. And I really think we're at a stage now where, a misstep from one side or the other and things could get really, really serious. There was an incident that happened all the way back in 2001 where a American spy plane was kind of in the kind of region of China, and it actually had a collision with a Chinese plane, right? A Chinese pilot died. The Americans had to bail out and were stuck on the island of Hainan in China for a while. In the end, the regimes were able to resolve it. The Americans were sent home. There was a sort of vague statement where both sides were able to save face. And can you imagine that happening now in the current climate we live in, with the kind of the Chinese social media nationalists, the Republican Party being what it is? It's kind of really impossible to imagine, which is scary.
Okay, so Mark, Helen-Ann, we've talked a lot about the rising tensions between the US and China. But Mark, how likely is this to spill over into actual open conflict, a hot war rather than a cold one, if you like?
Well, I go back to the point I made earlier, is that neither side wants it. It's not in their interests, because it would be a world war like nothing we've ever seen before. But that doesn't mean that they can't stop it from happening. There's another really interesting story. It was just a couple of days after the January the 6th protests here in Washington in 2021. There was a phone call between General Mark Milley, the top US general here, and General Lee, his Chinese counterpart. Milley had to pick up the phone and call his Chinese counterpart to tell him that the Americans were not about to bomb China, because the Chinese had picked up some incorrect intelligence from the Americans, from Trump, that something was about to happen. It was all incorrect, but there was a line of communication that existed where the top American general could pick up the phone, speak to his Chinese counterpart and say, look, relax, this isn't going to happen. That line I don't think it's in place at the moment. I don't know if you've got any more on that, Helen-Ann, but it's not good. The comms are not good.
What an anecdote, what a story. So do you think from that moment on January the 6th in 2021, communications, the back channels, the diplomatic conversations have deteriorated between China and America, Helen-Ann?
Yeah, I think the other thing that plays into that communication channel is, the reality of what's happening here is that President Xi Jinping's regime is increasingly a regime of loyalists and allies and, for want of a better word, cronies, than it is of technocrats and professionals. So a lot of the relationships that previously existed, these people maybe aren't in those jobs anymore. And we've got sort of nationalists and party loyalists and Xi allies in some of these top positions. And just in a very practical sense, some of those kind of channels have kind of closed, quite aside from whether they've closed off the back of, upsets and whatnot. So, yeah, I think it's a significantly more difficult atmosphere.
And a final thought from you both. In light of the growing tensions and distrust that we've discussed between the two countries, what hope is there, do you think, of any de-escalation or diplomatic breakthrough? Mark, to you first.
Well, given that we were only a few weeks ago talking about the visit of Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, to China, where he was due to meet the Chinese president, it's all fallen apart very, very quickly. I mean, an optimist would say surely they can build it back up again to the extent that visit can be back on. Hopefully, but things are not looking good, and the language is stark. Within America, China's the new bogeyman. China is the Russia or the Soviet Union of the Cold War. And it's hard to row back from that, especially as we're getting into an election season in America, where this sort of thing plays well with Republican candidates for sure.
Yeah, it's absolutely true that the Chinese don't want a war. They don't want a war, for all the kind of human reasons, the financial reasons, but also remember the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, which is the sort of the army here in China, they've actually never fought a war. Officially, the PLA have never fought a war. So there are a lot of questions about to what degree the military here would even be ready or capable to fight a war like that. That is definitely a thing that plays into their minds in the back. I think the other thing here that if you wanted to be an optimist, you could call on is I do think that Xi Jinping cares a lot about his international reputation. He cares a lot about, and we saw that in the last year when Biden and Xi sat down at the G20 in Bali, and both of them said, we have responsibilities as the leaders of these superpowers to fix our relationship. We have a responsibility to not let it spiral because many other countries around the world rely on us having a stable relationship. So an optimist might say it's not beyond the realms of possibility that seeking to heal some of this damage might be a kind of a diplomatic play he would want to make. But look, as Mark said, there are just the unpredictability of them and this seeming inability to resolve even small things. Just small incidences have ways of allowing things to spiral further. And sadly, I think it's likely to continue to be as bad, if not a bit worse, for some time to come, I think.
Mark, Helen-Ann, it's been great to speak to you both. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
My thanks to Helen-Ann and Mark, and to you for listening to the Sky News Daily with me, Sally Lockwood. This episode was produced by Rosie Gillett with Alex Eden. The editor is Paul Stanworth.